The following program has been made possible by financial support from the Camille and Henry Dreyfus Foundation.
Welcome to Science in the Written Word. I'm Lou Massa. Today I'm speaking to Dr. Gertrude Elion, Scientist Emeritus with the Glaxo Wellcome Company. She graduated from Hunter College, where she was a chemistry major. Over the years, Hunter's been honored to present her with the President's Medal of Hunter College, to induct her into the College Hall of Fame, and to award her an honorary doctorate of science. Her list of other important honors from all over the world is literally too long to review. However, I will just mention she's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and she received a Nobel Prize in Physiology Medicine in 1988. I want to discuss with her the purine path to chemotherapy, her life, and her work leading to the Nobel Prize. Nice to have you with us, Dr. Elion. Could we go way back to the beginning, actually? Do you have recollections of growing up in New York City?
I did indeed grow up in New York City. I was born in Manhattan and raised in the Bronx. And we moved to the Bronx actually when I was 7 years old, and it was considered a suburb at that time. I went to Hunter College. And
I was going to ask you, were public schools in general your mode of progress, and were public schools important to you, say, including Hunter College?
Well, public schools were really the only way people thought of education in those days. And they were good public schools. We got a very good education. I went to a public high school, Walton High School, and then on to Hunter. And it never even occurred to my parents, I think, that there was any place that would be better to get an education than the public education.
Tell me about Hunter. For example, chemistry majors. You were a chemistry major. Were there a lot of them? And were there women who were chemistry majors? And were you encouraged?
You need to remember that in those days, when I entered Hunter in 1933, it was all women. And we were 75 chemistry majors in that class, which I think is probably more than they have today. It was an amazingly large class. And most of the girls, I think, were planning to teach, and that was considered quite a normal kind of career for a woman to have. There were a few of us, however, I think, who were mavericks and decided we really wanted to use chemistry in a different way and to become actual chemists. In my case, I also thought I was going to find a cure for cancer, which was my original motivation for becoming a chemistry major.
How did that motivation arise, actually?
Well, it arose when I was 15 years old, and my grandfather, who'd been very close to me, was dying of cancer, and I had to decide on a major in that September. And I decided, after watching how horrible his fate was, that the one thing I wanted to do with my life was to find a cure for cancer. And it remained a goal for the rest of my life, actually, even though I only came close. I came close in the aspect of finding a drug for leukemia. But it still remained a motivating force, and it was one that never left me, no matter what the obstacles were that were in the way.
Yes. Now, you mentioned that most girls, I gather, would have gone on to a teaching career, and that was not your path. But were you encouraged by people to think that it was reasonable for you to go off into research and so on?
Actually, I don't think I ever asked, and I don't think anyone ever said that it was reasonable. I just assumed it was, and was very surprised when I got out to find that no one else thought so.
So what happened on getting out? Did you go out and look for jobs?
Oh, I went looking for jobs. I was told that they'd never had a woman in the lab and I'd be a distracting influence. I was told that I wouldn't stay, I would get married and have children, and therefore I wasn't a good bet. And it really took the World War II to get me into a laboratory.
The point being that the men had gone off to
The
war.
men had gone off to war, and they were just had to take a chance, is what it came down to.
So what sort of jobs did you find in the laboratory at first?
Well, first I should say that during this time, before I got a lab job, I did go back to college and do a graduate degree, a master's degree in chemistry at NYU. And then I taught high school chemistry and physics for 2 years. And it was after...
In the public schools,
in
I
the
gather.
in high schools in New York. And it was after that that I got the opportunity to get a lab job. The first lab job I got was as a food analyst, and that was not terribly exciting, but it was a job, and I was back in the laboratory, and I was learning new instrumentation that we hadn't had when I was in school. And, you know, the things we did were test the acidity of pickles and the color of mayonnaise, and after a year and a half of that, I decided that I had better go out and find a research job. And I did. First, it was kind of a false start at Johnson & Johnson because they started a new pharmaceutical laboratory, and after 6 months, they decided that they didn't want a pharmaceutical laboratory. So I was out again looking for a job. And it was at that time I was very fortunate to get an interview with George Hitchings at the Burroughs Wellcome Pharmaceutical Company.
Great. So you basically spent years...
7 years.
7?
I went 7 years before I got to a research job at Burroughs Wellcome.
Yeah. Okay. Now, tell me about Hitchings and that first meeting and the atmosphere.
Well, the laboratory was a small laboratory. It was up in Westchester County. It was a branch of a large pharmaceutical company in England, but we only were about 45 people here in the U.S. Dr. Hitchings was head of the biochemistry department, which was himself and one assistant.
And he was a young person himself, I gather?
He was about 38 years old at the time, and he had had some experience at Western Reserve University, and he had been at Burroughs Wellcome for about 2 years when I came. So I was to be his second assistant. But the thing that was so exciting about this interview was that instead of asking me a lot of questions, he told me what he was doing, and it sounded very exciting. And what he was doing was to try to interfere with the synthesis of DNA, with the idea that if you could do that, you could interfere with the multiplication of tumor cells, of bacteria, of malaria parasites, and even of viruses. And how would you go about doing that? And his idea was to make what he called anti-metabolites. It was to change the structure of the compounds that were needed for the making of DNA in such a way that the cell would essentially be fooled into taking it up.
Are we talking about the bases that would be incorporated?
The bases, particularly the bases, the 2 purines and the 2 pyrimidines. And the work was sort of divided up that I would work on the purines and his other assistant would work on the pyrimidines. And that's the way we began. And I felt that this was such a promising area. Whether it would work or not, nobody knew. It was very early days. We really didn't know the structure of DNA yet. We didn't know the enzymes that made DNA. So we were sort of, it was almost a pious hope that we could do this.
Yes. It seems that way, given the state of knowledge at that time. The structure of DNA, as you say, was not known. I gather it was known that these 4 bases were part of DNA and what the relative abundance of the bases was and so on.
No, not the relative abundance. It was assumed that it was 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. That what you had was a tetranucleotide, these 4 bases, and that this was repeated over and over again. It was not known it was genetic material, but it was known that a cell, when it had to divide, had to make DNA. And so what we tried to do was to pick a cell that we could really test in the laboratory very easily. And there was a bacterium, Lactobacillus casei, which you could grow in synthetic medium, provided you added a purine, thymine as the pyrimidine, and folic acid. Now, you could use either purine plus thymine, or you could use folic acid, and then the organism could make its purines and pyrimidines. So what we did was test these compounds in this organism. If it didn't grow, if it prevented it from growing, then we said, okay, we have an antagonist. Now, what is it an antagonist of? We add back adenine. If it reverses the antagonism, then it's an antagonist of adenine.
Yes.
If it requires folic acid to reverse it, then it's a folic acid antagonist.
Yes.
And so we went.
In retrospect, it seems like a simple enough idea. At the time, would you and your group of, Hitchings and so on, have been the only people pursuing this, this particular line of reasoning?
I think we were, at the beginning, the only ones. There were other people who were pursuing other types of antimetabolites of amino acids, for example. And the reason we got started on this was that it was considered, the reason that sulfonamides worked on bacteria was they were antimetabolites of the metabolite para-aminobenzoic acid. And that's really how the whole idea started. Just about 2 years before, actually, that it was decided that the reason that you could inhibit bacteria was you had an anti-metabolite of something the bacteria needed.
Yes.
But as far as
Fabulous.
working with the purine and pyrimidine bases, I think we were the first.
Yes. So this is a great idea, a great line of reasoning to follow. Could we talk about the drugs that were developed? What happened, what sort of drug at first was important, and what use did you have in mind, if any? I mean, perhaps.
Well, the uses we were not sure of. In other words, we knew that we could inhibit some bacteria, some cells. The question was, which drug would go with which cell? So we had to spread the net as widely as we could. And we got the collaboration of the Sloan Kettering Institute. They had mouse tumors that they could test compounds on. So if it was active on Lactobacillus casei, we would send them to have it tested in tumors, in mouse tumors. And there was a mouse leukemia as well. But we also had our laboratory in England that was interested in tropical diseases, so they would test things on malaria parasites. And we would test things on other bacteria. And the way it turned out, the purines turned out to be compounds that worked in leukemia. And in fact, there were 2 purines that we made, 6-mercaptopurine and thioguanine, which were among the first compounds to find a utility in acute leukemia in children. And this was in the early 50s. Children were then dying of leukemia within 3 months of diagnosis. And with a folic acid antagonist plus mercaptopurine, we could at least prolong their lives for a year, and sometimes even as long as 2 years. But then we were right back in a situation where they were resistant to the drugs and went on and died.
But what happened subsequently to that? I mean, haven't you found that with a group of drugs that this
this was really
6MP?
only the beginning,
Yes.
really, because what happened then, showing that 6-mercaptopurine really did this, other people became interested in antimetabolites of purines and pyrimidines. And we began to get other drugs, cytosine arabinoside, methotrexate, compounds which in combination with mercaptopurine could begin to produce cures. So now we have 80% cure rate in acute leukemia of children, and mercaptopurine and methotrexate, which were the first 2 drugs used for leukemia, are still the drugs that are being used for maintenance therapy.
Yes. How about just before 6MP? Didn't you have an experience with a compound that was overly toxic and therefore it was dropped?
We did have another purine, diaminopurine, which was active in mouse leukemia and active in human leukemia. And it was actually tested in 4 patients at Sloan Kettering. but unfortunately, it was too toxic. It did produce remissions, temporary remissions in 2 patients. So we knew we were on the right track, and we knew that the purine area was going to be one that might really yield some gold there. Whereas the pyrimidines, at the same time that we were finding this active in leukemia, the pyrimidines were being found active in malaria. So here we were with these 2 arms, both producing results in very different sorts of situations. And the pyrimidine story went on to produce a good antibacterial, and our arm, the purine arm, went on to produce compounds which had other types of activity that we couldn't have anticipated. Mm-hmm. And one of these was a compound that was a derivative of mercaptopurine. It was essentially a prodrug made to be a sort of protected form of mercaptopurine to prevent its degradation in the body. And this compound, which goes by the name of Imuran, turned out to be very effective in inhibiting the immune response. And of course, people always say, why do you want to do that? And the reason you want to do that is if you want to give a transplant, you have the body trying to reject an organ transplant. You want to protect the organ by inhibiting the immune response. And that's exactly what did happen and was the beginning of really of kidney transplantation.
Yes. Is Imuran a case where you had a different idea originally and it seemed like it wasn't doing what you want, but on second thought it turned out it had these immunosuppressive qualities that you were able to turn to your advantage?
Well, that's partially true, but what it really was a prodrug for mercaptopurine. That was what we intended it to be. And indeed, it was just as active as mercaptopurine on leukemia, but it wasn't any better. The disappointment was that it wasn't better. We thought it would be. The meantime, we found that 6-mercaptopurine had an immunosuppressive effect and decided that we would look at Imuran as well, and for that one, it turned out to be better than mercaptopurine, which was not anticipated. Mm-hmm.
And is Imuran, in fact, still widely used for
it is still widely used for kidney transplants. And in fact, for 16 years, it was the only drug available for preventing rejection. Now there are many others as well, but Imuran is still being used.
I'm thinking now of subsequent developments. Allopurinol was a compound that came up somewhat after this.
Yes.
Could you tell us what the circumstances there were?
Well, in a way, it was the same idea of trying to protect mercaptopurine. Maybe I should go back for a moment and say that we studied the metabolism of mercaptopurine in the human, discovered that a lot of it was being wasted. It was being oxidized, methylated, destroyed. The sulfur was being taken off.
Before it was ever used?
Before it was ever incorporated into DNA. So our idea was to prevent its destruction so there'd be more available to go into DNA. And allopurinol had exactly the same motivation. One of the things that happened to mercaptopurine was it got oxidized by xanthine oxidase to thiouuric acid. Now, this is the same enzyme that makes uric acid. And so we thought, well, if we prevent 6-mercaptopurine from going to thiouuric acid, it will make it much more potent. And it did. It actually increased its potency 4-fold. Mm-hmm. The only trouble was it increased its toxicity 4-fold as well. So we weren't any better off in terms of potentiating mercaptopurine, but then occurred to us, well, if it will prevent the formation of thiouuric acid, why not uric acid? Mm-hmm. And of course, gout is a disease which is due to too much uric acid, both in the blood and in the urine. And so we began to try it for gout, and it became a wonderful treatment for gout.
And it's still used successfully?
And still is one of the major drugs for treatment of gout.
Now, could we go back to the diaminopurine story?
Right.
Didn't it subsequently find a use in leading you to into virology and so forth? Is my impression of that correct?
That's absolutely correct. At the time that we were studying diaminopurine, we realized it was a very good adenine antagonist. However, as I mentioned, it was toxic, at least on bone marrow. Well, years later, when we began to turn our attention to antiviral agents, there was a compound that appeared in the literature in about 1968, which was adenine arabnoside. Now, adenine arabnoside turned out to have antiviral activity with not a lot of toxicity. And when I saw that, the first thing that occurred to me was diaminopurine was a very good imitator of adenine. What would happen if we made diaminopurine arabnoside? Which we did, and lo and behold, it was just as good an antiviral drug as adenine arabnoside. And we began to study it in great detail, and we studied its metabolism. We discovered it was converted to guanine arabnoside, and lo and behold, it was a very good antiviral. And following along this line, we began to think, well, why not leave the guanine intact and begin to change the side chain? Maybe it doesn't have to be arabinose. Maybe it can be another sugar. And then along came Howard Schaefer, who'd been making acyclic derivatives of purines with a side chain that was only half of the deoxyribose chain. And that compound had 100 times the activity of any of the others. So we ended up with a guanine derivative with an acyclic side chain that we call acyclovir, which turned out to be an extremely potent inhibitor of herpes viruses.
How well does it work? What's the experience? And is it still in use?
The experience in the last 20 years has been amazing. It has not only done what it was supposed to do, but it has done it without toxicity. It has been used for not only herpes infections of the eye, herpes infections of the brain, herpes infections of the skin, like cold sores. It's been used for genital herpes. It's able actually to prevent recurrences in genital herpes. It's used for chicken pox. It's used for shingles. And as I said, it's not only potent, but it's very selective. It again, was something we didn't know when we first made it, but it turns out that it's activated by enzymes that the virus itself codes for. So you don't have an antiviral drug until the virus is present and really converts that to a phosphate, at which point the cell looks upon it as a real nucleotide and converts it to a triphosphate, which is the real antiviral drug.
Yeah. Isn't there something, I mean, we've mentioned, I don't know, 5 or 6 drugs and perhaps 8 or 9 diseases at least. Isn't there something wonderful about the process that you could start with a fairly small, simple molecule and change it a little bit and have that lead you to yet another drug, which on more complete understanding and smaller changes again lead you to yet another drug and so on? It seems like a wonderful process.
Well, it has been wonderful.
Yes.
There's no question. I think a lot of it has been hard work, a lot of it's been luck, but I think the original idea was right. And the thing that was so exciting, in addition to finding drugs, was the fact that we discovered so much about the biochemistry that led us on to make other drugs. The things we didn't understand at the beginning, you have to realize that in the 1950s there was this great explosion of knowledge about DNA, the structure, the enzymes responsible for making it, and our compounds just fit perfectly into this whole scheme.
Yes, it's wonderful. Well, there came a point, I guess, around 1988 where you got a phone call indicating you, in fact, were going to win the Nobel Prize. Has that changed your life in any perceptible way, or?
I was asked when that happened whether it was going to change my life, and I said no, it wouldn't. But I was wrong. It has changed it considerably.
In what ways?
Well, for one thing, I'm very much in demand for speaking to students. I think they want me to go and tell students that they can do it too. If she could do it, you can do it. And it's true. I feel that way, and I think the students feel that way when I tell the story. Because there wasn't anything so exceptional about me. It was that I got there at the right time and the right place. I was a very hard worker, I admit. But I think that if they go into something with the kind of enthusiasm that I had and the kind of desire, really, to make it work, that they can do it. And I try to tell them how rewarding it's been, not just because of the Nobel Prize, but because of the people we've helped. I mean, I meet people today who have kidney transplants who are still taking Imuran.
That must be an overwhelming experience,
It
actually.
is an overwhelming experience. The people who come to me whose children had leukemia, who've been cured, who took mercaptopurine. I mean, there's hardly a time when I talk anywhere that there isn't somebody in the audience who has benefited from one of the drugs.
Well, Gertrude Elion, Nobel laureate, your research has had an overwhelming impact on human health and medical care. I appreciate very much your coming to speak to us. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
The preceding program has been made possible by financial support from the Camille and Henry Dreyfus Foundation.